Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Jessica Chu. I'm a member of the ICCT communications team. Thank you for attending our webinar. Today, we'll have multiple presentations that will last approximately 45 minutes total, and afterward, we'll have an additional 15 to 20 minutes for question and discussion. It's very exciting because we have more than 115 people registered at this event. But before I begin, I just have a few housekeeping items to just introduce. So this webinar is now being recorded, and we will send out a recording to all participants sometime next week, so you should look out to that. Everyone's microphone is currently on mute. If you have questions about the presentation, please write them in the question block in the control panel. That's on the right side of your screen. And we will be collecting these throughout the presentation and answer them during the Q&A session. So finally going to the actual webinar. Today we're going to talk about bolstering California's climate policies against new challenges, and we'll have 4 presentations by a group of experts. But before I begin, I'll let Jane O'Malley, ICCT's fuel researchers, introduce our presenters and give you a brief overview of the topic. And Jane, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Jane O'Malley, and I'm a fuels researcher with the International Council on Clean Transportation. Today, I'm joined by several colleagues from the environmental community, including Jonathan Lewis, Director of Transport Decarbonization at Clean Air Task Force, Jeremy Martin, Senior Scientist at Union of Concerned Scientists, and Connie Cho, Associate Attorney at Communities for a Better Environment. We are also joined by ICCT Fuels Team Lead, Nikita Pavlenko, who will serve as question moderator. Over the last 2 decades, California has been a leader in implementing environmental policies and regulations and has served as a model for other states aiming to address pressing issues around public health and climate change. Transitioning from an economy that runs on fossil fuels to one that runs on alternative technologies requires a great deal of collaboration, innovation, and persistence, and a critical eye to ensure that alternative solutions do not land us in the same position as business as usual would. Now that this transition is underway, we've spent a lot of time thinking about California's climate policies, their progress to date, and their ability to deliver solutions that are both lasting and equitable. Today, we'll take a particular focus on the Low-Carbon Fuel Standard, or LCFS, the country's largest subnational clean fuels policy. So let me share my screen, just a moment. All right. So I will start the presentations off by summarizing key messages from a briefing paper that we published this past summer titled Setting a Lipids Cap Under the California LCFS. So California drafted its first major piece of climate policy in 2006, which directed the Air Resources Board to develop a scoping plan, outlining ways that the state will achieve its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. For the transport sector, the LCFS was identified as a strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants, decrease dependency on petroleum, and diversify the fuel mix for on-road vehicles. The program has undergone several revisions since its implementation in 2011 and aims to reduce the carbon intensity of on-road transport fuel 20% by the year 2030. The LCFS is a market-based, technology-neutral standard that assesses the climate performance of fuels on a sliding scale basis. This rewards incremental improvements to a fuel's greenhouse gas intensity score, incentivizing emission reductions across the fuel's production supply chain. The one exception is indirect land use change, where emissions were estimated by an expert working group and set constant for common biofuel pathways. In conjunction with the agency's 2022 Scoping Plan updates, ARB is expected to raise the level of program ambition beyond the 20% reduction target. Now moving into lipids. What are they? Lipids are fat-based compounds that have historically been consumed for food and animal feed and in consumer-based products such as soaps and cosmetics. Lipids can be classified into 2 major categories, vegetable oils and waste oils. In the US, the largest sources of vegetable oils are soybean and canola oil. Other types of lipids include waste fats and animal fats and waste oils such as used cooking oil or UCO, animal fats, and distillers corn oil, a byproduct of corn ethanol refining. The chart on the right shows the availability of lipid resources in the US, with soybean oil and UCO providing the largest volumes. Other vegetable-based oils, such as canola and distillers corn oil, make up a significant share of the total resource base. Today, one of the largest applications of lipid compounds is for the fuel sector. These materials can be converted to bio and renewable diesel that are either blended or dropped in as a neat fuel into conventional diesel engines. Demand for these fuels, known as biomass-based diesel or BBD, has rapidly taken off in California. BBD fuels now account for 50% of volumes credited under the LCFS, up from only 1% in 2011, as you can see from the figure on the right. Other fuels, such as electricity, have exhibited growth, but at a lesser pace. Not only has growth in fuel markets been distributed unevenly, this growth has come at the expense of other US states. The share of BBD consumed in California has grown to more than 40% of the national fuel market, despite the fact that California makes up less than 10% of transport fuel demand. And most of this growth is attributed to renewable diesel. Renewable diesel burns cleaner than biodiesel and is compatible with existing fossil fuel diesel infrastructure. Renewable diesel also receives substantial policy support under the LCFS and Federal Renewable Fuel Standard. As a result, several large refineries in California have moved toward retrofitting their facilities to support competitive quantities of renewable diesel production. So despite the perceived advantages of lipid-based fuels, they present significant downsides due to their unique market and sustainability risks. I'll explore those risks at a macro scale on the following few slides and propose a policy fix that could help mitigate their unquantified greenhouse gas emissions impacts. Consumption of lipid-based biofuels is linked with food price spikes in grain and vegetable oil markets. This issue is top of mind today amidst the war in Ukraine and global inflation. Although many factors contribute to price fluctuations in commodity markets, there is evidence that increased demand for biofuels has contributed to food price increases over the last 15 years. On the chart on the right, you'll see that crude soybean oil prices nearly tripled between January 2019 and May 2022, alongside an increase in soy BBD demand. Prices have fallen since that point, but demand for food-based biofuels is expected to continue to apply pressure on global food markets. Vegetable oil BBD is also not a cost-effective fuel. Soybean oil prices are on average 35% more expensive than wholesale diesel on a volume basis, and as a mature technology, these costs are unlikely to drop over time. Lipid feedstocks are highly resource constrained due to competition from other use sectors. Increasing their production would require land expansion and its adverse environmental impacts. Because vegetable and waste oils are highly substitutable, increased demand for one resource can lead to the production of another one in a highly globalized economy. Research has found a direct link between US and European soy biodiesel demand and a rise in palm oil imports from Southeast Asia. Soybean planting itself contributes to deforestation and biodiversity loss in the Amazon rainforest. On the right, I've included a graphic from a paper published on soybean expansion in South America, demonstrating the loss of forested land from soybean planting over the last 20 years. And waste oils have a lower carbon footprint than vegetable-based alternatives, but they also present sustainability risks. There have been several examples of waste oil fraud prosecuted in the US and European Union where fuel suppliers falsely labeled virgin vegetable oil as waste oil to receive fuel policy credits. UCO production and collection is also supply constrained. ICCT research has found that the quantity of UCO exports exceeds the volume of resource potential in several countries in Southeast Asia, indicating fraud. And consumption of waste oil biofuels also has an indirect greenhouse gas emission impacts. This occurs when feedstocks are diverted from existing uses toward the transport sector, requiring the production of substitute materials to take their place. Our research has found that indirect emission impacts nearly double the carbon intensity of waste-based BBD. So we've learned that the production of lipid-based fuels contributes to land expansion, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity loss, and that these trends are only expected to increase as oil refiners move toward retrofitting their facilities to support high quantities of renewable diesel production. So what can policymakers do about this? Following an example set in Europe, we recommend that California cap the volume of lipids credited under the LCFS to limit unrestrained growth in lipid fuel markets. This cap can be calculated based on the volume of lipid fuels consumed today in California and the state's share of growth in domestic lipid supply. Future growth is quite limited due to resource constraints, so our proposed cap is near the current level of lipid fuel consumption, or 1.3 billion diesel gallon equivalents for the year 2030. We expect that setting a cap could mitigate the upstream emissions impacts associated with lipid fuel consumption that are not adequately captured in their carbon intensity scores. It could stimulate growth in non-lipid fuel production and also assist in delivering on the state's long-term decarbonization goals. So with that, I'll now hand off the presentation to Jonathan, who will expand upon these issues and discuss the importance of supporting a balanced portfolio of technologies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. I am indeed going to try to build on some of that and start off with a little bit of the context in which we are operating and thinking about how to optimize our policy strategies for delivering decarbonization by mid-century or sooner. So Jessica, if you could go to the next slide, which I'm not going to dwell on. This is some information about CATF for folks to review if they're interested. Next slide, please. So a little over 15% of global warming pollution comes from vehicles globally. That's not the whole story. As you can see from these charts, and I apologize that it's a little bit of an eye test, the transportation sector is anything but monolithic. There's a significant diversity in vehicle types and patterns of use within this sector. And we currently use more than 10 types of transportation fuel, and it's unlikely that we're going to have one solution, one energy carrier to fully decarbonize the sector. We're going to need a bunch of different tools to address the significant diversity within this sector. Next slide, please. Of course, transportation emissions also undermine public health. Diesel emissions are of particular concern. And so the maps on this page come from a new interactive tool that Clean Air Task Force put out earlier this year that charts the staggering damage that diesel emissions from the transportation sector inflict on United States communities. So that damage includes more than 8,800 deaths, 3,700 heart attacks, hundreds of thousands of respiratory illnesses, and approximately $100 billion in monetized health damages per year across the United States, according to EPA data. So that's the context in which we're operating. We need to reduce our global warming emissions, and we need to reduce health damaging pollution as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. So the policy that is of perhaps most interest to Clean Air Task Force and other groups is a Clean Fuel Standard, because we think a Clean Fuel Standard can be a powerful tool for eliminating transportation sector emissions. However, the existing approaches, which are best exemplified by the California Low-Carbon Fuel Standard and the success it's had throughout its implementation, also show that targeted and structural fixes will accelerate the deployment of the most health and climate beneficial technologies. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are both targeted fixes and structural fixes that we think should be applied to existing clean fuel standards and potentially to any national clean fuel standards that might be developed or any state clean fuel standards that may be developed going forward. So a key challenge for these standards is that they depend on imperfect analyses. Existing life cycle greenhouse gas analyses, or LCAs, struggle to capture the wide range of direct and indirect environmental impacts from biofuel production. Mainly this is because you cannot measure the impacts, the global emissions impact associated with biofuels. You have to model them, and the models depend on a bunch of economic assumptions, which are hard to validate and lead to very wide uncertainty bands. So when you have imperfect analyses that are giving us information that is highly uncertain or imprecise, or in some cases perhaps wrong, it leads to policy distortions. And so the limits of these life cycle analyses can at times distort the implementation of policies like a low carbon fuel standard that rely on LCAs to differentiate between the biofuels that are actually climate beneficial and those that aren't. And when your policy isn't doing a good job differentiating between, for example, good biofuels or bad biofuels, you can get market distortions. And so under the existing low carbon fuel standard in California, biofuels with lower uncertain environmental benefit can receive more incentive than they otherwise should if we had a perfect analytic structure, and in the process impede the impede the implementation of better options with more certain environmental and climate benefits like electrification and hydrogen. So to overcome these unfortunate shortcomings of an LCA-based clean fuel standard, we need guardrails, and those guardrails are needed to prevent over-reliance, particularly on biofuels that have hard to measure and potentially enormous scale-dependent negative environmental impacts. And so Jane just talked about the lipids cap, and that's, I think, a terrific example. Other safeguards that have been discussed are limits on land expansion, limits on certain types of conventional ethanol. But the lipids cap that Jane laid out, that's described in a terrific paper that Jane and Jeremy are co-authors on, would do three things that I think are really important. It would prevent over-reliance on biofuels and therefore would promote a balanced portfolio of decarbonization tools we need. Again, I mentioned electrification and hydrogen-based fuel cell vehicles as being two of the leading examples there. It would also ensure that California is only consuming its proportional share of lipids, and it would, very importantly, from a climate perspective, curb the impetus for land clearing in places like Indonesia and Malaysia that around palm oil production that are due to increased demand for vegetable oil from markets like California. Next slide, please. So in addition to targeted fixes, we also need some structural fixes. And the big structural fix that Clean Air Task Force is focused on is making low carbon fuel standards, clean fuel standards, into zero carbon fuel standards. And that's more than just a semantic change. But the idea is, rather than set a carbon intensity goal for some year in the future that, right now the California LCFS is requiring a 20% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030, what the policy should do, whether it's the California policy, other state policies, or perhaps most importantly, a federal clean fuel policy, it should run that trajectory, that carbon intensity trajectory, down to zero by a date certain. That's demonstrated by the chart on the side. You can see the blue bars to the left demonstrate the carbon intensity that's been achieved by the California low carbon fuel standard up through 2022, and then where it's projected to be through 2030 to comply with the 20% reduction. And then from there would pursue a linear reduction of the carbon intensity to zero by 2050 to meet our sort of generally agreed upon transportation sector reductions. And so by explicitly targeting zero, it sends a critical signal to the transportation market, both vehicle manufacturers and fuel producers, that fuels that cannot achieve carbon intensity of zero, and examples of that are land-intensive biofuels like soy-based biodiesel and corn ethanol. Investments in those types of fuels are best thought of as short or medium-term strategies at best, while it would also focus attention on fuels and technologies that are truly compatible with a zero greenhouse gas transportation sector. So everyone's on the same page in terms of where this policy is going and can make investments and compliance decisions accordingly. So I think that's it from me. Thank you very much. I look forward to taking questions later.
So I guess I'm up next. Okay, great. And I will share my screen, which I guess you can see now. So my name is Jeremy Martin. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I've been working on the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard for the last almost 15 years now, and my predecessors and colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists even before that. So this is a policy that we've taken a great interest in, and generally one that we are very supportive of. We think clean fuel standards, like California's low carbon fuel standard, make a lot of sense as a complement to greenhouse gas standards for vehicles and renewable energy standards in the power sector, as a way to get us to zero emissions in line with avoiding keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 C. So generally, a lot of good things about this policy, but also some lessons learned over the last decade that I think we have an opportunity to address now and make the policy stronger so that it works as well as possible for the state of California, and also so that it can serve as a model for other states and ultimately for future national transportation policy. So I'm going to talk through 3 lessons learned broadly, and these are summarizing a recent blog I put out, and I'll include a link to that at the end. So the first point I'll make is that people often talk about low carbon fuel standard as a technology neutral policy, but California's overall climate policy really is not any longer technology neutral, right? We've seen recent announcements from the Cal Air Resources Board requiring 100% EV sales in the light duty sector by 2035, likewise getting to 100% clean energy. So the future of transportation in California is zero-emission vehicles powered by clean electricity, and that's basically the law of the land in California. And the low-carbon fuel standard is an enabling policy that needs to support the broader California goals. And so, the direction, the thinking about low-carbon fuel standard is that it's technology neutral, but I think that point can be overemphasized. What it really needs to do is to support California's overall climate objectives, and really that's focused on transportation electrification. Now, as Jonathan alluded to, though, transportation electrification is the central strategy, but it's not the only strategy. There are diverse transportation needs and fuels, and so there remains a role for biofuels and need to mitigate liquid transportation fuels from petroleum. But we have to keep that in the context of an overall strategy, which is aimed at transportation electrification. And I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is, here's a chart from data came from analysis for the Scoping Plan that was released in May. I guess a new version will come out soon. And what it shows is that the trajectory that California is on is to cut transportation energy in general, but especially to cut combustion fuels by 85% by 2045 and petroleum fuels by 94% by 2045. And so, it's no longer appropriate to, to treat the LCFS as, sort of treat as the equivalence between investments, for example, in reducing pollution from refining oil as equivalent to investments that support transportation electrification with renewable energy, because one is a kind of central strategy and the other is a strategy that's being phased out, right? The strategy here, 94% reduction in petroleum fuel, this is really the phase out of petroleum is the overall trajectory that California set for itself, and the low carbon fuel standard needs to support that. The next point I want to make about a lesson learned from low carbon fuel standard is that the way that the low carbon fuel standard plays out is really shaped and distorted by federal policy. And so it's important to consider that and figure out how to address it. Obviously, California does not have control over federal policy, but it needs to make sure that in the context in which it operates, it actually delivers the objectives that California has set for itself. So the example that we've already discussed is the over-reliance on lipid-based fuels. And the California low carbon fuel standard by itself probably would not have created this problem. It's the fact of the California low carbon fuel standard operating with the federal renewable fuel standard with tax credits, which has led to really counterproductive direction that the industry is going, which undermines the efficacy of the low carbon fuel standard. And so, some guardrails, as Jane described, limiting the share of compliance with the low carbon fuel standard that comes from lipid-based fuels, can make sure that California's policy delivers on California's objectives, and taking into consideration the other factors as well. Another example that is coming up and a lesson learned for addressing in the next round of amendments to the low carbon fuel standard are the excessive subsidies that the low carbon fuel standard is delivering for manure biomethane. CARB has been using the low carbon fuel standard as a funding mechanism to support the capture of waste methane for transportation fuel. And the policy's been especially generous when it comes to biomethane from manure. And this is based on a presumption that absent the low carbon fuel standard, there are no other obligations to capture this methane. So the assumption built into the analysis is that it would be released otherwise. And this leads to very large negative carbon intensity scores assigned to these fuels. And I think that seems like a clever idea, right? You take a problem of manure methane generation and you turn it into a solution to reduce transportation emissions. Sounds like a great idea. It's kind of solving two problems at once. But in fact, I think when you put these two together, it ends up being neither good transportation policy nor good agricultural policy. From a transportation perspective, the large negative carbon intensity score seems to suggest that running a truck on compressed natural gas, which is somehow linked to a dairy manure lagoon in Bakersfield, or maybe a swine manure lagoon in Missouri, that this is way better than an electric vehicle, right? The electric vehicle powered by solar energy would get a score of 0, carbon neutral, but somehow this CNG vehicle, which still has tailpipe pollution, has this very large negative score. Clearly, this is also weird because, as Jonathan mentioned, I mean, when we think about a zero emission future for transportation, we're not thinking about a few vehicles running on CNG and then other ones running on diesel. We're thinking about everybody getting to zero. So the negative scores, I think, create problems as transportation policy that send confusing market signals in the transportation sector about where California is headed, which really is towards zero emission vehicles away from combustion fuels. So that's the problem in the transportation side. But there's also a problem on the agricultural side. Analysis that UCS commissioned has found subsidies are going to manure, confirmed what others, which is are going to manure biomethane, are so large, they drastically exceed the costs of capturing the methane, distorting the market for milk or for meat, and subsidizing the largest mega dairies that are most cost effectively generating manure and methane. But those whether subsidizing those is a good idea is really a question of agricultural policy. And for sure, that's a big concern of some of the environmental justice groups that represent communities near these huge dairies that are really concerned about a lot of the impacts of these big facilities, and very concerned that subsidies related to transportation policy would be, driving them to get even larger. The other point, sort of just more generally, is that you always have to be cautious when you're subsidizing the creation of a pollutant so that you can destroy it, right? The idea here is to reduce methane pollution, but what we're actually doing is creating a big incentive and a big subsidy for production of methane in this way. And digesters are really not the only or the best way to address methane pollution in agriculture, which is certainly an important issue. Moreover, because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, 27 to 30 times more polluting than carbon dioxide over 100 years, that means that it's much more important to reduce methane pollution than it is to offset a little bit of natural gas in the transportation sector. So yeah, that's another problem here. But why is this related to federal policy? Well, the reason is the straightforward solution would seem to be to move from a subsidy to a regulation, to regulate methane pollution from agriculture. But the way that the low carbon fuel standard is set up now, where the subsidy is available to manure digesters anywhere in the country, but obviously a California regulation could only be applied in California. So there's some challenges there to address this problem. I do think there's some solutions, ways to, and essentially to not be so cute and try to do two things at once, but to focus on, separating the credits for avoided methane pollution and using those to reduce methane pollution, and in a way that doesn't subsidize its creation. And then, I think there's some examples there which draw from the way that CARB is treating electric vehicles in the low carbon fuel standard that can help. But I won't say more. I've submitted some comments and they're linked in the blog. I'll have a link at the end. So the last thing I want to talk about, well, two pieces. There's a future risk, I think, also when we think about the low carbon fuel standard, that we'll see excessive investment in carbon capture and storage in the petroleum supply chain in a way that really doesn't serve California's interests. I think that's especially true. I mean, there's a parallel, I think, with the renewable diesel situation, which is that with the recently enacted subsidies for carbon capture and sequestration and for hydrogen, we could see, a lot of activity that makes economic sense, for oil refineries, taking into consideration the combination of state and federal policy, but really doesn't make sense for California. The carbon capture and storage at oil refineries will be time-consuming and expensive. It's really untested, and implementing it will be occurring in exactly the same time frame that California is essentially phasing out the use of refined petroleum products in transportation, which is their main market, and transportation combustion transportation fuels in general. So it's really I think the regulators working on the low carbon fuel standard should be very cautious about using a lot of the low carbon fuel standard to support the reductions in the petroleum supply chain, which aren't really going to be useful over time for California. It should make sure that the investments supported by the low carbon fuel standard are the ones that California needs, and not just the ones that make the most sense to oil refineries, given the combination of state and federal policy. So the last point I want to make is that really, to figure out some of these things, we need to start thinking about this in a slightly different way, which is we need to understand, as I showed in that first chart, California's plans really are to phase out petroleum. And that's a big deal. It has implications for a lot of people, for refinery communities, for workers in the facilities, and for policymakers trying to, figure out what is appropriate for transportation fuel policy. And so we've been recently joining our environmental justice allies and advocating for California to develop an plan to provide information for all of the information for all of the key state information for all stakeholders, and also to help policymakers make smart decisions about what to do in policy. One of the things we hear a lot is, oh, well, the oil refiners can switch to renewable diesel, or they can, use carbon capture and storage. If we look at the plan is to move away from combustion transportation fuel. So there may be there's a limited opportunity, something like 15% of the current fuel consumption will be required. So somebody's got to produce that, and there may be some opportunities there, but we shouldn't be confused about what the scale of those opportunities is, and the fact and how they sort of fit into the overall plan, which really centers transportation electrification. So the low carbon fuel standard and other policies, we should make sure that they're supporting the mitigation in the transportation fuel sector that makes sense for California, and make sure that the thinking in that and the policy support for those kinds of actions is informed by all the stakeholders, and especially those who've been most harmed by by pollution from the production and use of petroleum-based fuels over the last decades. So that's hopefully that was helpful, and it sort of summarizes the blog, which you can find online here, and also more details on some of these things are linked in these comments. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jane, I guess.
We'll move to Connie's presentation now. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks for the invitation to join. As Dr. Martin said, it's been a real pleasure to work with some experts on the low carbon fuel standard to really understand its implications for refinery communities. I'm Connie Cho. I'm an attorney with Communities for a Better Environment. And for some, you might be wondering, how did they get an environmental justice advocate to show up on a panel about market-based mechanisms? But I think that it's been a really important process for environmental justice, environmental scientists, researchers to all come together when we don't have a lot of time left on the clock of the world to address the climate crisis together. And California is certainly one of the leaders on climate, and getting the low carbon fuel standard right is important both for communities here at home and for the rest of the world. So I'm here to provide some context and understanding of the stakes of this work to improve the LCFS and bring in some lessons from the ground. At CBE, attorneys and science researchers work with and are led by the residents of some of the state's most pollution-burdened areas. In Richmond and Wilmington, communities live and breathe the toxins emitted by oil refineries and extraction sites. In East Oakland and Southeast LA, they are subject to massive transportation diesel corridors. And as I bolded here in the headline of this presentation, here on this slide, it's not by accident or some simple choice that our communities live in what the Cal EnviroScreen tool has identified as the most pollution-burdened parts of the state. It's because of a history of government and private sector policies and practices, state-sanctioned redlining, inlending, and zoning that have created these conditions of environmental racism. And this is an opportunity for state regulators and advocates to turn this legacy around and to side with environmental justice. So why are we talking about oil refineries if we're looking at alternative fuels? I think that Dr. Martin provided such a great overview of that picture, and I wanted to just add a little more detail about California's oil refineries and oil refinery communities. So companies are starting to apply and receive permit approvals to retrofit their petroleum refineries to produce lipid-based conventional biofuels. Some of the lipid-based fuels that Jane and Jonathan were talking about earlier. And before we jump into discussing those retrofit conversions, here's a little more information about the current landscape of California's oil refineries. There are about 15 refineries in the state, plus or minus whoever's operating. And the LA area has the majority of the state's oil refining capacity. The Bay Area has a large swath of refineries. And then there's a smaller amount of refining capacity out in the state. But except for a couple, California's refineries are actually incredibly massive. They range up to, producing 380,000 barrels of oil a day. The Chevron refinery, for example, in Richmond sprawls over 2,900 acres. Many of these are ancient. They're really over a century-year-old. And for a century, these inherently polluting refineries have had repeated explosions and fires that have endangered workers and residents, have killed workers, and sent thousands, tens of thousands of residents to the hospital. What we know is that greenhouse gas emissions and particulate matter pollution are increasing under California's latest fuel transition policies. In the latest Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment report on emission trends from pre-cap and trade implementation about 2011 to the most recent years, data is available in 2018, the state actually identified increases in greenhouse gas emissions and increases in particulate matter pollution in refinery communities and hydrogen communities, which are typically one and the same because nearly all dirty gray hydrogen right now is used in co-located refining processes. And as a public health refresher, there's actually no safe level of particulate matter exposure. And that's why refinery communities are seeing double or more rates of chronic respiratory and heart disease, cancer, neurological disorders, and damage in infants, children, and the elderly, and ultimately early deaths. It's, of course, been made much worse by COVID. These conditions have meant that COVID-related mortalities are found highest and disproportionately in low-income communities of color like this one. This is a photo of CBE community members, kids, children of community members, adult community members at an elementary school near Harbor College in the Phillips Refinery in Wilmington, where there's a concentration of 5 major refineries in just a few square miles. And these emissions are visible, but there are always hidden burning gases inside to create heat to run the refinery. So there's constant invisible pollution as well. Now, refineries are still zooming into LA. So this is modeling from the South Coast Air District that shows the annual average air pollution plumes from oil refineries, which are really concentrated in Wilmington. So despite being right next to the port of LA, despite trucks being the biggest source of diesel particulate matter, diesel trucks and transportation vehicles are still not the largest pollution source for particulate matter, PM2.5 and volatile organic compounds, VOCs. It would still be oil refineries. And although oil refineries are still a close second to, ocean-going vessels sort of lead for NOx pollution, refineries are close second, and a lot of those ships are really crude oil vessels coming in to be refined. Oil refineries have started to file and have approved Tier 2 LCFS applications and received approval to begin documenting biofuel production in order to receive low carbon fuel standard credits. We've seen local permit approvals at cities and counties for about 67,000 barrels per day at the Phillips 66 Rodeo project, producing over 1 billion gallons, projected to produce over 1 billion gallons per year. And this is an extraordinary amount. If it were all soy, which we know it wouldn't be, but if it were all soy, it would take up the entire landmass of Indiana to produce the amount of soy crop that you would need to run that refinery at its projected levels. And Marathon in Martinez has been approved to produce about 735 million gallons per year, about 48,000 barrels per day. And Paramount is at 25,000 barrels per day, and previously was only refining waste oils, but now has expanded to soy and other food crop-based pathways. So especially after all these presentations, we might want to know on the ground, what are the estimated amounts or proportions or volumes of these particular feedstocks needed for these projects? Or how much in greenhouse gas emissions can we expect these projects to emit in our communities? How much in air pollution can we expect these projects to emit? And how much should workers and communities and local governments rely on the stability or longevity of these projects if there is actually limited feedstock in reality, or if there are ecological or sustainability concerns, food system and food price concerns? CBE filed 3 lawsuits against Contra Costa County and the city of Paramount because we can't actually answer these questions based on their environmental impact reviews, as we believe they are required under local law or state law. And instead, localities and these companies are in part leaning on the inclusion of these feedstocks in the low carbon fuel standard, and the old environmental assessments that discuss these indirect land use change challenges and these concerns, but do not apply them at the project level. And I share this to say that the stakes of getting the LCFS right at the state level is critically important. State regulators and state advocates need to be serious about creating safeguards within the crediting program itself, because we cannot rely on project level analyses at the local level to protect communities and the climate. We know that big oil lobbyists have an incentive to prevent any sort of feedstock cap, and even vaguely acknowledges that they are soon to be defunct and stranded assets otherwise. And so we're really looking in the environmental justice communities, our CBE members really want regulators to step in and to facilitate the transition, a responsible transition for workers and communities. we think that transition needs to involve coordination and the exchange of insights, not only with local governments, but also the regional air districts that spend a lot more time regulating and thinking about oil refineries. These are not trusted actors historically when it comes to the climate crisis. And there's a good record, a recent record to understand that regulation and enforcement is paramount to the functioning of a low carbon fuel standard that keeps companies accountable to communities. So when the Phillips 66 recently, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District actually provided notices of violation for Phillips 66 failure to start or to receive the appropriate permits, which is dangerous and which is unfortunate because it bypassed the community CEQA, community transparency CEQA process. And there was a distinct lack of coordination between the state and the air district in reconciling how these types of investigations would be treated how these investigations would be treated as these pathways were being considered. And now I just want to emphasize that these biofuel conversions are not some, process of Phillips 66 or Marathon jumping in to provide cutting edge algae-based biofuels or Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. Not that this is an endorsement from the environmental justice community of any of these different technologies, but that it's to say that there are motivations for protecting these pieces of infrastructure, because even prior to the pandemic, oil refineries were running really thin margins, and otherwise these pieces of infrastructure would be defunct. And so these crude to biofuel refining conversions are an attempt to utilize these otherwise stranded assets in a way that provides a lifeline forward. And I think that CARB needs to, and anyone else and any federal regulators should take a really hard look at thinking about whether they're in the business of extending the lifeline for fossil fuel companies. Finally, California's a net exporter of petroleum products. Exports have increased. This is data from the CEC and from CARB to showing that under the low carbon fuel standard, there hasn't necessarily been a displacement effect that the LCFS initially may have wanted to motivate. And increases in imports and increases in exports simply means that there are continued emissions of GHGs and pollution in refinery communities that harm our communities. And why would oil companies continue on this path? What we've seen over time is that oil and gas companies have relied on loopholes in bankruptcy law to relieve themselves of environmental remediation obligations and allow them to shed liabilities like worker pensions. So the status quo is really allowing oil companies to dictate the terms of a giant infrastructure transition to clean energy and provide and to shift remediation burdens onto taxpayers. And so one of the things that we have been really heartened by, actually, by the leadership at the CARB board has been to hear an affirmation and acknowledgement of this overall picture and wanting to include a plan or a planning process to look at the supply side picture of refining in California and to have a multi-agency approach to planning a full fossil fuel phase down or phase out over time. I want to emphasize that, environmental justice communities recognize actually that there is a large dependency on oil company tax bases, and that in other agencies and other regulatory processes, there are community planning processes to figure out how to generate alternative revenue, how to build out clean energy economies and a regenerative economy. And we really need CARB to play their part in ensuring that there are predictable, reliable milestones, and that we're not being driven by an effort to save otherwise stranded assets from the fossil fuel industry. And instead, these are some interns that I worked with this summer, Brianna, Veronica, instead supporting the future of California's youth and the next generation of people who want and to build a new life here in California.
Thank you to all speakers for the great presentations. Now we will move to the Q&A section of the webinar. Remember, if you have questions, write them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will answer as many as we can. And now let me introduce my coworker, Nikita. He's ICCT's Fuels Program Lead, and Nikita will help moderate the Q&A.
Sure, let's get started. So while I acknowledge you all are in listen-only mode, we really value your input. So don't be shy and submit a question. We will get to as many as we have time for. So we've already got a few, so let's get started. This one is for Jane. Can California simply cut down its biomass-based diesel use by electrifying the heavy-duty sector instead of changing the LCFS? Why is the lipid increase a long-term problem?
Yes, great question. So in terms of electrifying HGVs, we see mandates like ZEV mandates and more technology push as complementary to the LCFS, which provides something of a market pull for bringing these technologies and having a sustained funding stream for electrification. So fortunately, the LCFS does provide some ways to reinvest credit funding to support infrastructure, reinvest in programs like low-income reinvestment programs, as well as fast chargers, where it can create a positive feedback loop to reinvest the money credited under the program into building out more and more infrastructure for the long term.
We also have a question here for Jonathan. So since California now has a net zero carbon goal for, by 2045, should the LCFS instead aim for a 0 grams per megajoule target by 2045 instead of 2050, as you had presented?
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's a great question and great point. I think Jeremy spoke to this, that there needs to be calibration between the different policy incentives that are under development or in place in California. Whether or not the net zero target for 2045 and the zero carbon fuel standard that hit zero at around 2050 need to be perfectly aligned is a great question. I'm gonna look into that. But in general, whether it's precisely or closely, there does need to be stronger alignment between California policy priorities and the specifics of the policies in place.
And we have another question for Jonathan here, but I think this one is open to everyone. So maybe I'll give it over to you first, but others can jump in if you have anything to add. So in your presentation, you suggested land-based biofuels like soy couldn't meet a zero carbon standard, but there could be a case where life cycle emissions modeling for these fuels could report a zero emission value for those fuels, subject to favorable assumptions on issues like co-products, soil carbon, ILEC. How would you respond to representations from the biofuel industry that claimed a net zero carbon intensity corn ethanol or soy, that it was possible, and that it has a right to be included in such a zero carbon fuel standard?
Well, really briefly, I think this speaks to one of the main challenges with biofuels is that there is now and probably perhaps forever going to be significant uncertainty around what the carbon intensity of those fuels is, what's the actual climate impact. Because again, we have to model those impacts, and those models have to make a lot of assumptions around things that are hard to get our arms around. I'm pretty skeptical of life cycle analyses that show a zero carbon intensity for any land intensive biofuels. I don't think any of them have come close to that yet. And there's while there's research that shows the carbon intensity might be lower than the standards that than the carbon intensity values that California is using, there's also a lot of research that suggests that California is using carbon intensity values that are far too low. So I think that uncertainty is unfortunate, is going to continue to complicate the use of biofuels as a compliance option, and I think should strongly point us in other directions.
Yeah, maybe
anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I also think, I mean, one of the ways that people get to zero carbon intensity biofuels is that you have a negative term, right? Because clearly, there's emissions associated with growing crops and refining them and transporting them, and so the way you get to zero is by adding some negative numbers to that. And I think this is maybe a question of sort of counting conventions, but if the ethanol facility, for example, is capturing carbon for sequestration, I think that's actually a co-product. It's a different business that they're in. Just as oil refineries, produce both, gasoline and diesel, but lubricants and asphalt, and we try to separate out the emissions from the gasoline and diesel from the emissions associated with the asphalt. So I actually think it's not helpful to call that, that ethanol zero carbon ethanol. It's still a combustion fuel. It still has tailpipe emissions. There's still emissions associated with producing it. I think it's probably more helpful, and even helps the the ethanol industry to figure out what its revenue stream is, right? Is to understand they're engaged in two businesses. One of them is trying to make a low carbon fuel and reduce emissions as much as possible, and the other is if they're in this carbon removal business and capturing carbon for sequestration, that's a different business they're in. And I think it's actually creates less confusion to separate those. I mean, this is partly, I talked about the biomethane example where you've kind of combined producing, methane as a substitute for natural gas with avoiding methane pollution from agriculture. And those are really two activities, and you need to make sure you're doing both of them. They're both important, but sort of glomming them together and saying, oh, actually, this natural gas vehicle is now a negative emission vehicle. I don't think that actually helps you get to good outcomes. So I think it makes more sense to say, both of these are important policy goals. It's appropriate to have policies to make those happen. But sometimes grouping them all together in a life cycle analysis adds more confusion than it adds clarity. And so I think separating them and encouraging them both to, in the case of carbon removal, maximize the benefits from that. In the case of biofuel production, minimize the pollution associated with that, and recognize that those are two separate linked businesses.
And I would just add along those lines, that there's just been so much uncertainty and debates around what's the proper carbon intensity score for crop-based biofuels, and it's quite difficult to accurately quantify it. So a better answer likely would be to actually set a limit on how much is introduced into the system, as regulators in Europe have done, just because of this high uncertainty, and then focus on improving emissions reductions along the supply chain in the meantime, but prioritizing things that we know really do provide long-term low carbon emission reductions.
Thank you. We also have a question for Connie. What's the status of the phase out of California refineries? Is there a concerted plan? If there is, what does that planning process look like?
So right now, the 2022 scoping plan draft does not include any sort of overall planning process. However, recently, and if you look at the refinery sector, it's actually modeled through in-state transportation demand. So it's really just a mirror of what the objectives are in the transportation sector, not necessarily what's actually being emitted and refined and both used in state and exported out of state, right? And so in response to a number of advocates, both from the environmental justice and environmental communities, the board chair, Leanne Randolph, and a number of board members, I think really took on the challenge of committing to, their September 1st joint EJEC and CARB board meeting, convening an interagency working group, much like, the technical processes that are involved to, refine the low carbon fuel standard, a process to think about overall petroleum refinery planning that will hopefully interact with the LCFS amendment process that's ongoing.
Thank you. Here's a general question. I'll open it up to the group. What type of modeling would you support to provide a reliable CI calculation for biofuel feedstocks? This kind of ties into the earlier question.
From my perspective, I'll say, I don't think there's a perfect model. I'm moving away from this idea that, like coming up with an adder and getting the perfect life cycle score will then, work through the low carbon fuel standard to achieve a perfect outcome. So, I guess my inclination these days is to say, do of the role of fuels in land use change, and then we can use that analysis to inform decisions about, how high should the lipid cap be? How much vegetable oil is California think makes sense to use in their transportation fuel mix? So, I guess I'm sort of after many years of working on it, moving away from thinking that like, oh, if we just had the right model, if we just picked the right model, then everything would work out perfectly, and thinking, this is actually a safeguard to avoid land use change, and that's associated with expanded use of biofuels. So we should use the information we have there, which is, complicated and uncertain, but use that to set guardrails that people are comfortable with, will mitigate the risks that are associated with it.
I'll jump in to say I'm largely in agreement with Jeremy. It's I think working on life cycle analysis issues in the context of the California LCFS and the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard has sort of largely convinced me that we're not going to find a perfect model. We have to sort of make do with what we have. We can continue to strive to improve those, but we've seen adjustments to these models, the different models used at the federal level and the different state levels that are, that are defensible, and some of which are, quite questionable. So yeah, I think we try to do as best we can with the models that are available to us, and we fix the problems that we know exist within those models through the types of measures that Jeremy and Jane have discussed, which is, on some level, it's a little bit unfortunate because, a key attribute, the LCFS is a very elegant policy in which, at least conceptually, everything is reduced to carbon intensity. But we've learned in practice that that's both a very powerful approach, but also leaves some issues unaddressed or poorly addressed. And so we need to figure out how to supplement the policy, how to bolster the policy to shore up those gaps.
Here we have a more general question. I'll direct to Connie first, but others feel free to jump in as well. With this push to net zero by 2045, how can California try and accommodate consumers who face barriers to adopting battery electric vehicles, whether for convenience or just technical limitations? Is there a role for biofuel and other liquid fuels in ensuring their quality of life? How can that be done?
Well, I can speak to some of the barriers and challenges to adopting EVs in low-income communities of color, where we organize and work with. And what I will say is that, while I love the incredible work of the transportation teams at CARB to flesh out, these advanced targets, and commit so much in funding to building out this BEV infrastructure, we really need to take, the 1.5 billion that was committed this year and use that same amount to start building it out in communities that currently don't have the ability to afford it. And so I think we really need to rethink the scale of investment that we need for communities of color and low-income communities that have these barriers. And I'll leave the biofuel specific question to the others.
Anyone want to jump in?
If you could remind me, what's the role of biofuels as we move towards electrification?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think it's been made abundantly clear that electrifying for the on-road sector makes a ton of sense, and it really is the right solution, not only from a environmental standpoint, a carbon intensity standpoint, but a cost standpoint, and it really is competitive on all those different metrics. I think obviously it's going to take some time to get there. So right now, utilizing this program, it can generate a lot of funding and credits and revenue streams that can be redirected and reinvested, as I alluded to before, into building out the infrastructure necessary for achieving this long-term transition, since it's going to take a lot of work to actually be able to access everybody, to have these charging stations working. This is a sort of interim policy that can help ensure that the vehicles on the road today are getting cleaner, but for the long-term solution that we're investing in stuff that we can use way out in the future to reach a decarbonized economy.
One thing to add, my colleagues would absolutely be very upset with me if I didn't mention this. I think that we have a lot of data to show that mass transit is something we really need in low-income communities of color, and it has not only benefits in terms of taking vehicles off the road, or people no longer need to use those vehicles that have emissions, but also other economic benefits of being able to access jobs, access city resources, access tighten social networks of care and things like that. So those are things that we know work, and CARB has put out a really or is recently advancing their VMT targets, and I think a much stronger relationship between CARB and localities, and really trying to empower localities and to take on this challenge is something that we should do.
All right, and we have one last question. I'll direct it to Jane first, but others feel free to jump in. So one commenter noted that Argonne National Lab, CARB, EPA, and others have come to seemingly very different conclusions on biofuels than the presenters here. They have estimated that biofuels do offer greenhouse gas reductions, even when taking into account ILUC, as CARB did. Given this, why do we recommend transitioning away from biofuels by 2045, as in Jonathan's presentation? Additionally, there was reference to palm oil in one of the presentations, despite it not being a permissible feedstock in the LCFS. Why is this relevant to US fuels policy?
Great question. And I guess the two parts are somewhat related. So first, picking up on the point of palm oil. Yes, palm oil is excluded from essentially all US fuel policy support. However, with this issue of vegetable oil substitution, their fungibility, that they can be utilized, you can substitute soy oil for palm oil, and vice versa in food and feed markets, and in sectors like the cosmetics sector. Therefore, if you take one away and direct it towards the biofuel sector, you're going to need another feedstock to take its place, and oftentimes palm is the marginal lowest cost oil, so therefore production really ramps up, and we've seen a lot of evidence of this actually occurring. So there's a lot of concern that even though palm is excluded from the policy, that it has these indirect linkages that lead to increased production. So along those lines, biofuels, yes, they do provide some greenhouse gas emissions advantages over fossil petroleum. We're not quite sure what the numbers are just because of the inherent uncertainty in quantifying upstream emission impacts. So because of that, because of all those indirect linkages, we want to be certain that we're investing in the lowest carbon solutions. And some of these biofuels might need to be reserved for other applications. It's been made clear that biofuels might be needed in aviation. So let's prioritize their usage and stuff where we don't have a better solution, when EVs have really made it clear that they do have huge public health and climate benefits.
I want to agree with everything Jane just said and add perhaps an additional point, which is that when I started working on biofuels 10, 15 years ago, the relevant comparison is how do these fuels compare to gasoline and diesel? Making improvements versus gasoline and diesel is still important, but when we look out a decade or two to where we need to be, we need to zero out emissions from the transportation sector. And so a fuel that is just a little bit better, or maybe even has half the emissions of gasoline and diesel, is not consistent, is not sort of aligned with a zero emissions by 2050 target.
And maybe I'll add one more point, which is that my position is not that there's no role for biofuels because of electrification, or that they're worse than fossil fuels. It's really that it's counterproductive and damaging to everybody, including the biofuels industry, to like redirect all of the U.S. production of soybean oil, which is currently food, into California's fuel market, right? I don't think that's in the interests of the biofuels industry. I think we need an appropriate role for biofuels. We can't electrify everything. There will be ample opportunities for biofuels in sectors where we can't electrify, and in the meantime, but it doesn't make sense to say that because they're a little better than petroleum, we should redirect what we're currently eating immediately into the fuel, the vegetable oil people eat. And so I think that's the thinking behind the lipid cap, is not to exclude these fuels from the program, but to make sure that they don't grow in a way which is counterproductive and damaging, because it does take land to grow these crops. There's only so much, it's competing with other things. So that's kind of a lesson learned for me, is that we want to avoid like shocks to the agricultural system from massive expansions of biofuels. And that's what's happening in the renewable diesel space right now. Really, you can read the industry press, like nobody knows, like if you look at how big these projects are, where on earth is the soybean oil going to come from? There just isn't that much. So these projects don't make any sense. And it's important to make sure that California is not driving counterproductive outcomes with its fuels policy. And that we have a sensible biofuel policy that works and doesn't create more problems than it solves.
Well, thanks everyone for staying a little longer. We really appreciate your input and wish we could have had the Q&A go a bit longer. Thanks everyone for joining today. We'll try to get a recording out and the slides within the next week.
Yes, and I wanted to reiterate that. Just thank you to everyone for participating in today's presentation. And then sorry that we went a little longer. If we didn't get to your questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And remember to look out for the recording that will be shared on ICCT's event page sometime next week. And thanks again, and we hope to see you soon. Have a good rest of your day, and bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.